In today's session, we have the opportunity to listen to two wonderful lectures on the topic Negotiating Borders in Dante and Beyond. Our first speaker is Professor Justin Steinberg. Justin Steinberg is a professor of medieval Italian literature at the University of Chicago. He is the author of Accounting for Dante, Urban Readers and Writers in Late Medieval Italy, published by Notre Dame in 2007, and the recipient of the MLA's Scaglione Publication Prize, and is also the author of Dante and the Limits of the Law, published by Chicago in 2014, recipient of the MLA's Howard R. Marauer Prize. Professor Steinberg is currently writing a book on Boccaccio, Law and Mimesis. He is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Dante Studies. Today, Professor Steinberg will discuss the topic Limes Lites, Border Conflicts in Dante's Inferno. So Steinberg, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers. I want to thank our chair. I want to thank all of my colleagues here. I'm honored to be here. Okay, I'll start. Today, I want to talk about a specific phenomenon in Dante's Commedia, a phenomenon that is especially conspicuous in Inferno. Time and again in the pilgrim's journey, he passes through borders. The borders between earth and the underworld, demarcated by the river Acheron. The borders between hell, upper hell, and lower hell, divided by the river Styx. The border between the violent and the fraudulent, the Geryon will allow the travelers to navigate. The border between Malabolgia and Cochito, which similarly requires the aid of the giants. To these major border crossings, I would add the various crossings between one circle and the next, especially in the first part of the poem, where Dante and his guide are continually opposed by the infernal guardians. I obviously am not saying anything new here. We are all quite aware of the frequent negotiations between Dante and Virgil on the one hand, and the hellish, monstrous, and demonic overlords on the other. Still, I would argue that because of their very familiarity, readers take these border crossings somewhat for granted. These crossings are part of the deep structure of the Commedia, the narrative support for the more famous conversations between Dante's and the souls. This is what we usually focus on, what happens within the circles, within a canto. Today, instead, I want to shine a light on the borders themselves, on what happens between one circle of hell and the next, and even between one canto and the next. I ask one simple question in this talk. Why does Dante stage the voyage through hell as a series of jurisdictional disputes? Virgil and the pilgrim are repeatedly confronted by an infernal administration, Charon, Minos, Cerberus, Plutus, Phlegyas, who attempt to deny entry into their seemingly independent kingdoms. Yet Virgil and Dante are protected by diplomatic immunity. They possess a right of way to pass unharmed through the other world. Once the infernal guards hear the authoritative formula, voci così colà dove si puote ciò che si vuole, they are powerless to resist. These local lords must honor Dante's passport, which is guaranteed by a universal divine emperor. That is, until the pilgrim arrives at the gates of Dis and is met by the rebellious devils. As you have probably already intuited, I see the voyage through hell as staging a conflict between universal imperial rule and local territorial powers. I'm thus continuing, in a certain sense, the conversation about universality between Professors Brilli and Kablitz from yesterday's session. For the rest of the time allotted me, I will examine an especially revealing illustration of this tension, the impasse at the gates of Dis in Inferno 8 and 9. But first, I want to put my cards on the table, so to speak, regarding how I view Dante's political thought in the Commedia. And I do this in order to avoid, as much as possible, misunderstandings. Disagreements, I'm happy with, but it's my job to avoid as much as possible misunderstandings. So, first, I don't believe Dante's political thought represents the view of the medieval period, but a view. Dante's political thought was profoundly influenced by his exile. He understood what it meant to lose the protections of one's local laws. It is no coincidence that he defends a universalist interregional law, a jus commune, and opposes any regional law that sought autonomy from this universalist law. This was his view and the view he promotes in the poem. But it does not represent the views of the lawyers of the kingdoms of France, Spain, and southern Italy. And I would add eventually it wouldn't represent as well the lawyers of the Italian city-states. So again, it's a view and a polemical view, and even perhaps a retrograde view. Second, with regards to its theological content, and I want to underline this, Dante's voyage through the other world is perfectly orthodox. At no point does he challenge, much less deconstruct, the absolute omnipotence of the divine sovereign. From a doctrinal standpoint, all drama in the Commedia is a mistake, a mistake of the characters or a mistake of the readers. At the same time, Dante wrote a poem, not a theological treatise. And the poetic form allows him to create narrative suspense and to make readers experience, for a moment, a world abandoned by its divine emperor. This is the nightmare imagined at the gates of Dis, a nightmare of unenforceable laws. As Dante says in Purgatorio, le leggi son, ma chi pon mano ad esse? The laws are there, but who lays hand to them? So now I'm going to pass to this reading of Inferno 8 and 9. This is a reading I've attempted in other contexts with other goals, but I want to see what happens today if we focus on this question of the problem of jurisdiction. In Inferno 8, having crossed the river Styx, Dante and Virgil arrive at the innermost gates of hell, the walls protecting the infernal city of Dis. As at previous border crossings, the administrators of this realm attempt to block the traveler's way. Thousands of demon guardians threaten Dante from atop the city's ramparts, snarling, "Chi è costui che senza morte va per il regno della morte gente?" Who is he there that without death goes to the kingdom of the dead? Right? It's a violation of their kingdom. The fallen angels will speak only to the shade Virgil, and they taunt Dante by daring him to retrace his steps through hell without a guide. For the first time in the poem, Dante directly addresses his readers. Pensa, lettor, se io mi sconfortai nel suon delle parole maledette, che io non credette ritornarci mai. Think, reader, if I became weak at the sound of those cursed words, for I did not believe I would ever return there. From the start of this episode, then, readers are called on to vicariously experience the pilgrim's anxiety. Dante heightens that anxiety by breaking the established pattern. Instead of defeating the infernal guardians with a simple formula, Virgil goes off to speak with the devils alone. Although he assures Dante he will not abandon him in the underworld and advises him to feed his spirit with good hope, Virgil leaves the pilgrim in a state of radical doubt. Quote, with yes and no arguing in my head. In fact, the diplomatic relations with the devils quickly falls apart. and Virgil returns angered and rebuffed. The devils swing the gates shut, re-enter the city, and prepare for a siege. Virgil assures Dante's character that they will nonetheless overcome the impending prova, the test, the prova, with their adversaries. He has already encountered their delusional hubris at another battle when they futilely attempted to defend the lower gates of hell. This is an obvious reference to Christ's victorious conquest at the harrowing. In a replay of that discensus, the travelers now await the arrival of a Christ-like legate. Tal che per lui ne fia la terra aperta. Such a one that by him the city will be open to us. The canto closes on this note of anticipation, ending atypically without resolution. This is what I was talking about, what happens between cantos. As modern readers of these cantos, aided by centuries of commentary, we know from the outset that the devil's refusal is only a temporary setback. We are already aware of and focused on the solution, culminating with the arrival of the angelic messenger. But a sense of reprehension is vital to Dante's project. The juxtaposition of the quick victories over the pagan monsters with the standoff the juxtaposition of the quick victories over the pagan monsters with the standoff with the Christian devils is purposely designed to create suspense. And the drama spans 2 cantos, cantos 8 and 9, and 150 verses. The break between cantos and the interlude of Medusa and the Furies also delays resolution, further embroiling readers in the fear and doubt of the pilgrim and his guide. Readers share Dante's character's messianic longing for a heavenly savior. Dante says, "Oh, quanto tarda me che altra qui giunga." Oh, how long it seems to me until someone arrives. Indeed, the entire episode can be read as an interpretive prova or test for the pilgrim and readers alike in navigating the hiatus, the gap between future past and future advents, between revelation and judgment, last judgment. We can observe this spiritual challenge when Virgil expresses a momentary doubt at the beginning of Canto 9. Virgil says, "Pur a noi converrà vincer la pugna, come in ciel, se non tal ne se verse." Still, we must win the fight, he began, unless such a one was offered to us. In his attempt to assure Dante that they will defeat the demons, Virgil wavers for a split second, contemplating a different outcome. Se non, unless. He quickly corrects himself, however, changing subject mid-sentence and reminding the pilgrim of the tal, of the such a one who has been promised to save them. This rare anacoluthen frightens Dante's character, above all for what it doesn't say. He fills in the gap of this parola tronca, truncated phrase, with his own pessimistic fantasy, most likely understanding a worse meaning, a peggior sentenza, than Virgil intended. In his inability to make the leap of faith from one end of Virgil's sentence to the other, Dante anticipates a similar hermeneutical failing in the next canto, that of Cavalcante del Cavalcanti. Cavalcanti notices that the pilgrim uses the past tense ebbe, had, when speaking about his son, who is also Dante's first friend, the poet Guido Cavalcanti. and anxiously asks, the father that is, anxiously asks whether his son is still alive, because Dante used the past tense. When Dante's character hesitates momentarily before answering, Cavalcanti assumes the worst and collapses back in his tomb. Predisposed to skepticism, the heretical Epicurean transforms a simple vocal pause into a blank canvas onto which he projects his metaphysical despair. If Dante and his readers are to avoid such a spiral of hopelessness, they need to experience the gap from this perspective of the eschaton, to live as if the Messiah were already here, even if all they can see on the horizon are the concealing fogs of Styx. This is the point of the anticlimax at the resolution of the episode. When he does arrive, the heavenly messenger opens the gates effortlessly, dispatching any hint of Manichaeism with a mere touch of a wand. He upbraids the devils for their continued oltricotanza, their arrogance, and returns whence he came, apparently annoyed at this petty task. The brevity of the angel's intervention puts into perspective the seemingly endless wait for his arrival, only seemingly. In retrospect, the entire drama at the gates is revealed to be nothing more than an impotent acting out. The devil's rebellion is reduced to a nuisance, a simulacrum of power without any foundation. From a theological standpoint, and this is what I said in my introduction, the crisis at the gates of Dis is one of skewed vision and perspective rather than a crisis of fact. This is, after all, a comedy. We know it will end well. Yet no one thinks, oh my God, is Dante gonna die, right? Or at least we shouldn't. Yet this very theological certainty, I would argue, creates a space to explore a much less certain political reality. I'm referring to the potential inability of the Holy Roman Emperor to enforce his own laws. Dante's fear that God has become a rex inutilis, who reigns but does not rule, is shown to be misguided, but its political analog, that the emperor has abandoned his laws, remains a real possibility in Dante's time. While God's command remains operative even during the suspenseful wait for the angel, for much of Dante's life, the seat of empire was in fact left vacant, constituting a real gap in effective rule. It is no coincidence that the devil's disregard of universal law comes in the form of a challenge to a writ of safe passage. Oversight of the roads and protections of travelers was the prerogative of imperial authority, right? Between the cities, who protects someone? The emperor. The emperor issued specific guarantees of safe passage to foreigners, diplomats, and scholars. So I want to say in parentheses, there's no nation state here. So between these smaller jurisdictions of cities and city-states, you have universal jus commune law. Border crossings were thus sites in which the emperor's valid power was made visible and effective. But they could also occasion a challenge to that power, bringing to light the discrepancy between de facto power and de jure authority. And that's why the lawyers like to say limes lites, as in my title, right? Borders, arguments. The devil's defiance threatens to reveal the fiction of the law's universality. In theory, that universality was guaranteed by the emperor, whose jurisdiction was circumscribed by no limits and coincide with the territory bounded with the rising and the setting sun. Without a belief in this transcendent figure, the common law risks becoming a dead letter. The historical Dante who never returned home from his ambassadorship to Rome, the loss of a genuinely universal law would have condemned him to a permanent state of insecurity. Ultimately, a loss of faith in this enigmatic Tal endangers not only the salvation of Dante's individual soul, but the survival of a political community. Although modern critics of these cantos generally identify this such a one that Dante and Virgil anxiously expect as a religious figure, an angel, a Christ type, or a Christianized version of Hermes, the messenger of the Olympian gods, over the centuries, commentators have occasionally proposed an alternative political reading, identifying him as Caesar, or maybe even Henry VII. Yet in many ways, this contrast between religious and historical figures is a false one. The exact identity of the messianic figure is far less important than the messianism itself. Dante purposely uses the indefinite pronoun to describe the anticipated savior. For this very reason, he wants to call attention to the messianism, not the Messiah. Tal, 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 he repeats. Through its very indefiniteness, Dante calls attention to the structure of messianism over and above any single instantiation of it. Even when the authority who guarantees them is difficult to envision, he implies, it is imperative to believe in the transcendence of the laws. The interregnum is an important case of this imperative. For the sake of the law, Christian citizens need to live as if the emperor were already crowned and reigning universally, right? This is a messianism that is oriented towards the present and how citizens live their lives because of their beliefs in the future, but always geared towards the present. In conclusion, Dante was neither naive or utopian. His messianism isn't about the hope of this far in the future rescuer. Like medieval lawyers, he understood that the emperor was no longer actually, de facto, a dominus mundi. But Dante was not a lawyer, he was a poet. And as a poet, it was his responsibility to maintain the fiction of universal emperor, even when the seat of empire was vacant. And he does so by conditioning the imagination of his readers. If the challenge of St. Paul, who Dante is always borrowing from within his messianism, if the challenge of St. Paul is to convince the new followers of Christ to live as if the Messiah might return at any moment, the challenge of Dante is to convince his readers to live as if a world emperor could return to power sometime in the future, like a thief in the night. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Steinberg, for this fascinating lecture. And we'll now move on to our next speaker, Dr. Chiara Caradonna. Chiara Caradonna is a senior lecturer at the Department of Roman Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In her research, she deals with modern and contemporary European poetry on the one hand, and with the so-called excessive novel that defies the genre's formal boundaries on the other. In this context, she is particularly interested in the intersections between literature, philosophy, and anthropology. In the first book, titled Opaque Shadows of Knowledge in the Meridian and in the poem Schwanengefar, published by Wallerstein in 2020, she analyzes epistemological and hermeneutic aspects in Paul Celan's later poetry. She has published on Paul Valéry and Edmund Husserl, Pier Paolo Pasolini, Daniel Sada, and Rainer René Müller. Lately, she has been focusing on the literature of southern Italy, and in particular on the work of Sicilian writer Stefano da Rigo. She plans to expand her latest article, titled The Ethnographer from Within, Wild Thought in Stefano D'Arrigo's Horcynus Orca, published in Arcadia in 2021, in a book tentatively titled Ethnography in the Strait, Beyond Nature and Culture in Stefano D'Arrigo's Horcynus Orca. Today, Dr. Caradonna will discuss the topic Crossing Waters and Meeting Monsters, Dante's presence in Stefano D'Arrigo's Horcynus Orca. Dr. Caradonna, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Yuval. I want to join Justin's words at the beginning of his wonderful talk and thanking my co-organizers of this conference. It was a long time in preparation, and I'm extremely thrilled and excited that it is now happening. And the discussion yesterday was already very inspiring, and I think along this line we can proceed, and I'm looking forward to the next panels. I have to start with a disclaimer. I won't fulfill the entirety of my title. I won't talk about monsters, but I will talk about crossings. It was just into 20 minutes, but I would confirm what Justin said, that there is such an amount of crossings in the Divina Commedia that actually I won't be talking about the same crossings that Justin discussed. And I will take you into modernity and into modern literature. So that is also a crossing of sorts from the Middle Ages to the 20th century. So I will share my screen. And we can start. I hope you see. Maybe give me a little sign, but I think you can see me. Okay, so I'll start. Horcynus Orca, the great novel, both in significance and in size, it counts 1,257 pages, was published in 1975 after over 2 decades of gestation. Its author, Sicilian writer Stefano D'Arrigo, imagined it as an odyssey of and for the 20th century. And he imagined it literally as a work of world literature, as he commented that dentro, and you see the translation in English underneath, dentro ci sono 49 storie e ognuna è dentro l'antica storia della nostra gente, della gente di tutto il Mediterraneo e di tutto il mondo. The protagonist, the sailor and fisherman Andrea Cambria, makes his way back from Naples to his native village of Cariddi on the Sicilian side of the Strait of Messina at the beginning of October 1943, after the liberation of southern Italy from Nazi fascism. Andrea is a Ulysses of sorts who finally manages to cross the strait only to find the fisherman community to which he belongs deeply affected and vexated by the war. They are suffering severe hunger because of the curfew imposed by the Allies, which hinders them from going out fishing. In order to survive, they will eventually give up their traditional way of living. So the question of the survival of a community that Justin just mentioned is at the center of the novel. The novel is nourished by an incredible amount of disparate sources that range from the already mentioned an ancient Homeric poem to the epic narratives of the Italian Renaissance, and reaches up to modern literature from Herman Melville and James Joyce to Franz Kafka, to name but a few examples. It is indeed a voracious novel that aspires, not unlike the Commedia itself, to encompass the whole of literary history while transcending it into something entirely new. It may therefore come as a surprise that Dante, as I will show in what follows, is at least content-wise not the main point of reference for the novel, as he is overshadowed by the predominance of the Odyssey as a model to be rewritten for the 20th century. Indeed, the references to Dantean verses and figures are, with respect to those pertaining to Homer, oblique, indirect, discrete. The way in which D'Arrigo manipulates and rewrites them is nonetheless telling of the confrontation with the father of Italian literature that he could not but engage with. The reason for this unavoidable confrontation resides in the aspect of the novel that is most revolutionary and for which it is best known, for better or for worse. What is truly unique about Horcynus Orca is indeed the language that D'Arrigo succeeded in creating in and for it. And it is here that Dante's presence is most felt, albeit as a figure of contrast and opposition. Neither dialect nor standard literary Italian, D'Arrigo created a new Italian out of Sicilian dialect, enriched by the many languages that have passed through the island in the course of the centuries, from Greek, Latin, and Arabic to Spanish and French. In this sense, the novel responds performatively to the notorious questione della lingua, to the question of what Italian language should be. More specifically, it reacts to the question of what Italian, the unitary language encompassing the multitudes of dialects scattered throughout the Italian peninsula that Dante had fantasized about in the Vulgaria Eloquentia, as we heard yesterday, might have become had it been developed from the Sicilian rather than from the Tuscan Vulgare. From this viewpoint, the whole project of the novel is profoundly yet polemically Dantean in nature. Faced with the literary giant that is Dante, in front of whom the Lombard 19th century writer Manzoni had famously felt compelled to wash his clothes, meaning his literary language, in the Florentine river Arno in order to Tuscanize it, D'Arrigo goes about the challenge of creating a new language by immersing it in the unruly, salty waters full of contrasting currents of the Strait of Messina. Additionally, and more provocatively, D'Arrigo grounds this new literary language of his on this one spoken by illiterate Sicilian fishermen, which Dante had excluded from the circle of dignified vulgars because of its slowness. The Latin says, quia non sine quodam tempore profertur. It takes time to say the words, right? In the Sicilian Vulgare. D'Arrigo's main structural and rhetorical device is inversion, and it can be observed quite strikingly in action with respect to Dante and the ever-burning issue of what constitutes the unitary language of Italy. As had once happened with the Commedia, readers of Horcynus Orca slowly but surely learn, apprehend its language, incorporating almost without noticing new words and syntactic structures into their own pre-existing grammar and vocabulary. In this sense, D'Arrigo's aspiration is similar to Dante's and is rather possibly entirely anachronistic with respect to the time in which the novel was published. Is our language still eligible to undergo such a massive shift by the hands of a single work of literature? Against the background of this question, which sustains the whole ambitious project of Horcynus Orca, Dante's presence becomes visible in the novel's tiniest folds. In contrast to such more subtle references, which I will address shortly, overt quotation of Dante seems to be possible for D'Arrigo only through an ironic take on the template he is referring to, another form of inversion that D'Arrigo applies systematically to almost all of his literary predecessors. The most striking example of this ironic strategy with regard to the Commedia is an episode at the beginning of the novel that is written along the lines of Dante's famous encounter with Pier della Vigna in the 13th canto of the Inferno. The choice of alluding specifically to this character may be linked to the fact that Pier della Vigna was a notable at the court of Friedrich II, and as such is part and parcel of Sicilian history. However, the way in which D'Arrigo deploys this reference preserves very little of the original's gravitas, of its weight, while revealing one of the novel's key tenets. Andrea, the protagonist, is wandering along the coast of Calabria as he is making his way southward in the direction of the strait. When he approaches an orange grove, a boschetto, a little forest, he suddenly hears a female voice addressing him as follows. A voi, marinaro con la barba, una parola, una paroletta, permettete, sentite. To you, sailor with the beard, a word, a little word, if you allow, listen. Andrea's immediate reaction, as reported by the narrator, leads us straight to the Commedia. Qua parlano l'aranciare, era stato il suo primo pensiero. La voce infatti, seppur di intonazione tutta naturale e umana anzi sino alla sfrontatezza, per lui che non vedeva la femmina, sembrò sgrovigliarsi, bassa e tenebrosa di segretezza, dalle parlanti radici di uno degli alberelli. The inversions operated here by D'Arrigo are manifold, starting with the conversion of the Dantean bosco fosco, the dark forest, without leaves nor fruits of the seventh cerchio to the novel's idyllic orange grove. Yet it is Ndria's own association that enables us, the readers, to draw this connection. Without it, our own thoughts might never have looked for this intertextual link. Ndria's association is in fact exactly specular to Dante's thought process. Dante thinks that the voices he hears may belong to people hiding behind the trees, and Virgil encourages him to break a branch to discover that in reality the trees themselves are speaking, as the suicide's punishment consists in being turned into plants. Ndria, in contrast, imagines that the female voice luring him into the grove's thicket, comes directly from a tree, instead of being uttered by a real person hiding in the grove. The structural inversion between the two scenes pertains to the relation between reality and imagination, between the literal and the metaphorical or the figurative. What can be literal in Dante's metaphysical journey in the afterworld, a speaking tree, cannot but be imagined in the very earthly travels of a sailor on his way home after a war that has left everywhere signs of its devastation. The ironic highlight of this reinterpretation consists in the transformation of the tragic figure of Pier della Vigna, unjustly accused of treason, in a woman that wants to attract Ndria into the grove in order to have him offer his sexual services to a young woman who fell into a catatonic state after the recent death of her husband in battle. The elder woman hopes that Ndria will be able to heal the younger one from her inconsolable grief. However heavily ironic, the episode hints to a common trope of modern literary readings of the Commedia, for in the 20th century, hell has broken loose on earth. Consequently, on the one hand, there is no need to imagine a place of eternal damnation and atrocious punishments, and on the other, whatever Dante described in his Inferno can be taken as a literal representation of the violence and destruction that have scarred the modern world and that cannot in any way be inscribed in a grand plan of divine justice. To say it with Justin's words, the as if is not possible anymore, it doesn't work anymore. In this sense, Ndria is also a modern Dante, yet his journey will in no way lead him to ascend to the divine. This fact finds further stark evidence in the more subtle way in which the Strait of Messina, which Ndria needs to cross in order to finally return home, is described. In fact, the strait, arguably the novel's true protagonist, repeatedly assumes, as the scholar Walter Pedulla has already alluded to, characteristics of the rivers of hell that Dante has to cross along his journey and that Justin mentioned in his talk. This parallel reading is discreetly suggested right at the novel's very beginning. Ndria is introduced as he reaches a promontory overlooking the strait's Calabrian side at the sunset of his fourth day of travel. The dramatic changes of color on the strait's waters are described at length and in the pictorial fashion that betrays D'Arrigo's familiarity with painting, as well as his long-time activity as an art critic. Ndria Cambria vedeva così la notte, una notte doppiamente tenebrosa per oscuramento di guerra e difetto di luna, rovesciarsi fra lui e quell'ultimo passo di poche miglia marine che gli restava da fare per giungere al termine del suo viaggio. E intanto che la notte si inondava sempre più per Tirreno, mangiandosi il mare di sangue pestato come ci dilagasse dentro col suo nero inchiostro, egli andava misurando, come una volta, stando a bordo dell'ontro, la brevità di quel passo di mare, remando una palella dietro l'altra. Oh, oh, sul poco fiato della spada agonizzante che smaniava, nuotando nel suo ultimo sangue, e dentro quel breve miglio era già morto. E le acque davanti al paese delle femmine sentivano appena la punta della sua spada, perché da Cariddia lì il suo era un salto solo nella morte. The darkness of the quickly impending night in which we first meet Ndria is reminiscent of the darkness that envelops Dante at the beginning of the Commedia, the Selva Oscura, and later L'Aere senza stelle of the third canto. Notably, in the first canto, Dante uses a maritime simile that is, again, specular to Ndria's condition in order to describe his exit from the Selva Oscura. E come quei che con lena affannata, uscito fuor dal pelago alla riva, si volge all'acqua perigliosa e guata, così l'animo mio che ancor fuggiva si volse a retro a rimirar lo passo, che non lasciò giammai persona viva. In contrast to the episode of the speaking tree, Here, what is figurative for Dante is literal for Andrea. And whereas Andrea has, at this point, yet to cross the waters in front of him, Dante looks back at the peril he has already overcome. This comparison will indeed become more relevant in its literality when Andrea finally manages to reach the other side of the strait, a nearly impossible task given that most of the boats have been destroyed or confiscated and a curfew is in place. But let us dwell further on the novel's opening description. The setting sun covers the sea's surface in a red hue, for which D'Arrigo uses the expressive metaphor of a sea of stamped blood, il mare di sangue pestato. This metaphorical blood turns, in the space of but a few lines, into the real blood of the swordfish that Andrea remembers from his day as a young fisherman, before being conscripted in the Italian army as a sailor. The last sentence of the passage, da Cariddia lì il suo era un salto solo nella morte, is ambiguous. In its immediate context, it refers to the dying swordfish, but in a wider sense, it anticipates Andrea's own fate at the end of the novel. In the brief space of a couple of paragraphs, the description of the setting sun and the memory of the dying swordfish evoke a metaphorical and literal scenery defined by the spilling of blood. The atmosphere of this apparently realistic scene thus becomes, without any all too explicit indication for it, decidedly gloomy and uncanny. This is even more the case if we read the sea of stamped blood, il mare di sangue pestato, alongside the Dantean description of one of the rivers of hell, the Flegetonte, as a riviera del sangue la qual bolle, qualche per violenza in altrui noccia. Much later in the novel, the image will be taken up again as a literal description of the way in which the war has impacted the strait's waters, as the remark is uttered, I quote, era passata la guerra, la carneficina, il mare di sangue. The war had passed, the carnage, the sea of blood. The death toll of the battles waged in the sea around Sicily in the summer of 1943, when the Allies landed on the island and the Italian and German armies gradually withdrew towards the mainland, literally transformed the strait's waters into a bloodbath reminiscent of the stream of blood, of the Riviera del Sangue, Dante had imagined the sinners of violence to be immersed in. Through this superposition, the dead soldiers are not only immersed in their own blood, but also, as the sinners in Dante's 12th canto, in the blood of others that they have spilled. The infernal aura surrounding the strait is further outlined in one of the novel's central episodes, when Andrea finally reaches the Sicilian coast with the help of an exceptional ferrywoman named Cicina Circe, who appears to be the only person to still have a boat with which she regularly traverses the strait, defying the curfew. Ironically named after her Homeric predecessor Kirke, she later turns out to be a smuggler and a prostitute. At this height of the novel, however, she mainly is the skilled seafarer who knows how to use the contrasting currents in the strait to her advantage in order to reach her destination, and who has, moreover, developed a skilled solution to brave the main obstacle that makes the crossing hard, psychologically rather than physically. The sea is so full of dead bodies that the boat risks getting stuck among them. In order to avoid this, with a little bell, Cicina enchants the dolphins, locally called fere, that then swim along the boat's sides, protecting it from bumping into the corpses. Cicina herself explains the situation to Andrea during their crossing. Qua è così pieno di morti che non ve lo potete nemmeno immaginare. È tutto un grande via vai di nudità mascoline sfigurate. Succede che varate a morto, succede che ci impuntigliate in mezzo a sti meschini alla deriva e li sentite che vi battono sul legno implorandovi sepoltura, sepoltura. Sì, le fere mi servono a sbrogliarmi la navigazione di tutti sti fantasmi di marinai che se ne stanno impantanati qua, piedi piedi. Mi servono a questo, sì, a pilotarmi in mezzo a st'anime vaganti. The way in which the dead soldiers are referred to gradually but significantly shifts in the course of Cicina's explanation. From being dead, disfigured male nudities, nudità mascoline sfigurate, they become poor men adrift, meschini alla deriva, pleading for burial, and finally ghosts, fantasmi, and wandering souls, anime vaganti. The physical dimension is progressively abandoned in favor of a spiritual one that attributes to the dead soldiers a restless life after their violent death, the life of those who cannot find peace because they haven't received proper burial. The association with the genti fangose ignude tutte con sembiante offeso, the muddied people naked with damaged or harmed appearance that are immersed in the swamp of the Stygia in the seventh canto of the Inferno, suggests itself straightforwardly. As a very earthly fairy woman, driven by self-interest, passion, desire, and grief, Chichina represents a parodical inversion of the gruesome ferrymen of the Commedia, such as Caronte and Flejas. Ndria, by contrast, displays a further similarity with Dante. Dante famously falls asleep on the bank of the Acheronte, e caddi come l'uom cui sonno piglia, only to wake up quite disoriented in the next canto on the other side, looking around in order to assess where he is. E fisso guardai, he says, per conoscer lo loco dove io fossi. I stared around to learn what place it was surrounding me. Ndria's situation as the boat steered by Chichina approaches the Sicilian coast is exactly the same. Non si trattò che di una semplice chiusura d'occhi, perché addormentandosi a mare all'altezza delle palme, si ritrovò sveglio a terra davanti alle palme. Un sonno attaccato con la saliva, potente però per il modo in cui gli ottenebrò la mente. Scrutò intorno in quel buio fitto, sforzandosi poi di riconoscere il posto. D'Arrigo is quoting the Commedia almost literally here. In spite of this, a significant discrepancy between the two characters has to be taken into account, namely that while Dante is beginning his journey through hell, Ndria is arriving home, albeit only to leave it again soon. But their disorientation is analogous, and once again the discrete and seemingly irrelevant reference to the Commedia envelops what is to follow in the novel, Ndria's encounter with the fisherman community devastated by the war, in the eerie, dark atmosphere of the Inferno. Further minute references to Dante can be tracked all along the novel's 1,257 pages. Instead of continuing the list further, dissecting where and how D'Arrigo modeled his protagonist after Dante, after Dante's character, I would like to conclude by pointing to a macro-structural parallel between these two literary masterpieces that seem to me of great significance. In the Commedia, nautical metaphors and similes are frequent and play an eminent role in the key passages of the text. Think of the opening of Purgatorio, of the Purgatorio, percorre il miglior acque, alza le vele, ormai la navicella del mio ingegno, che lascia dietro a sé marsi crudele. A similar nautical image to describe the creative effort returns in the second canto of Paradise. O voi che siete in piccioletta barca, desiderosi d'ascoltar, seguiti dietro al mio legno che cantando varca. Tornate a rivederli i vostri liti, non vi mettete in pelago, che forse, perdendo me, rimarreste smarriti. I would like to advance the hypothesis that when D'Arrigo decided to turn a humble Sicilian fisherman, whose life is entirely dependent on the little vessel, la navicella, that he owns, into the protagonist of his monumental novel, he was indeed, among other things, taking up Dante's nautical metaphor and providing a most literal, modern translation of it. In Horcynus Orca, waters are continuously and perilously crossed. The characters are constantly concerned with finding a vessel that will secure their livelihood. With Dante's imagery in mind, we may read the prominence of sea and boats in D'Arrigo's novel as an allegory that takes us back to the questione della lingua that I mentioned at the beginning. Against this background, the novel becomes, as a whole, a majestic attempt to rebuild with new wood, a new language, a new literary boat, after Dante's Legno has lost its ideological viability, while using some of the pieces left to us after the shipwreck. If we consider this passage from the figurative to the literal at work between the two texts, the novel's closing scene appears to us in a new light. In the novel's final pages, Ndria is shot in the head by an allied sentinel in the port of Messina, as he is on a boat training a group of inexperienced youth for an upcoming rowing competition. With the money he had been promised in exchange for his participation in the competition, Ndria was hoping to buy a new boat that would enable his community to return to its former activities disrupted by the war. As he falls dead, the other crew members steer north towards Cariddi in order to at least bring Andrea's body back home and give him the burial denied to so many other soldiers. And I quote, la lancia saliva verso lo Scille Cariddi, fra I sospiri rotti e il dolidoli degli sbarbatelli, come in un mare di lagrime fatto e disfatto a ogni colpo di remo, dentro, più dentro dove il mare è mare. If Andrea may be read as a figura Dante's, as I tried to outline in this paper, then his end surely is profoundly divergent from that of his predecessor, and possibly more similar to Dante's Ulysses. And yet, in the novel's closing sentence I just read, he seems to have in death gained the following that Dante had cautioned with the words, you may, by losing sight of me, be left astray. In spite of the tragic event of Andrea's sudden and unexpected violent death, someone else is taking over his role and task. Someone else, the readers included, is following his legno che cantando varca. Even though Andrea's and the novel's end coincide, we are left wandering with A, but maybe also with O, wandering deeper still where the sea is sea, dentro più dove il mare è mare, where the literal and the figurative dimensions of language collapse into each other. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Chiara, for this wonderful talk. And
good evening, and thanks for inviting me to chair a session at this wonderful conference. It really looks just so impressive. I will be chairing the session titled Exile and Migration in Dante and Beyond. And the two speakers will be Sefy Hendler from Tel Aviv University with his talk Il suo exilio indegno, Michelangelo after Dante, using exile as a political token, and Kristina Olson from George Mason University, and her title is Dante's Migrant Purgatories, Lo, Nabil, and Sedira. I will begin by introducing Sefy Hendler. He's a senior lecturer in early modern Italian art history at Tel Aviv University's Art History Department. He also serves as the director of the Eugenia Schreiber University Gallery, where he curated several exhibitions. Sefy Hendler obtained his doctorate from the Sorbonne, specializes among other things in the paragone, competitive comparison between painting and sculpture. The paragone was the subject of his first book, La Guerre des Arts, le paragone peinture sculpture en Italie du 15e au 17e siècle. Was winner of the Lerma per l'Arte Best Manuscript Prize 2010. His book about the Medicourt dwarf, gracious and beautiful monster, the literary universe of Bronzino's Nano Morgante, was published both in English and Italian. Sefy Hendler also contributes regularly to scholarly catalogs of major Renaissance exhibitions worldwide, including Bronzino, Artist and Poet at the Court of the Medici in 2010, Maniera, Pontormo, Bronzino, and Medici Florence in 2016, Florence, Portraits of the Medici Court 2015 to 16, and the Medici Portraits and Politics in 2021. Sefy, please.
Thank you for this generous introduction, Vivian. I would just share my PowerPoint. Here we go. I just moved to full screen. And I would also like to wholeheartedly thank Gur and the organizing committee for the opportunity to discuss this evening two Florentine titans, Alighieri and Buonarroti. As many of you, many of you, I'm not properly a Dante expert myself. I am an art historian, as Vivian noted, studying mainly Roman and Florentine Cinquecento art and society. Yet, as many of you know all too well, Dante was a fundamental figure for many Florentines during the 16th century. The case of Michelangelo is intriguing because Dante was, for him and his close circle, not only a divine poet, but also a key political figure setting an important moral example. that of an honorable exile unjustly imposed upon him. In my lecture this evening, I will first try to describe the artist's admiration towards the poet based upon information gathered from contemporary sources, both biographical and autobiographical. I will then examine the political implications this veneration towards Dante produced. Finally, I will briefly analyze the post-mortem reaction to Michelangelo's death by the Medici ruler of Florence, Duke Cosimo, and suggest his reaction might have been related to the late artist's identification with the poet. Let us start by asking, what do we know about Michelangelo as a reader of Dante? Michelangelo Buonarroti, born in Caprese in Florence in 1475, was by 1550 the most famous living artist on the Italian peninsula, with no fewer than 5 biographies written about him during his lifetime or just soon after his death. Michelangelo received an unusual amount of attention from contemporary historians and writers. The first biography that was published and immediately became widely available was Giorgio Vasari's Vita of Michelangelo. And here's the frontispiece of the Vita. This laudatory biography appeared as an elaborate conclusion to the first edition of the Vita, Lives of the Most Famous Italian Architects, Painters, and Sculptors, the first probably modern art history book published in Florence in 1550. Dissatisfied for many reasons, I will not elaborate now, but Michelangelo was dissatisfied with Vasari's biography, and he reacted swiftly by authorizing the publication of his, what we would call today, official biography by Ascanio Condivi, a book that was published in 1553 in Rome, where the artist lived for almost 2 decades now. The biography, Condivi's biography, written dal vivo oraculo himself, as Condivi attests in the first pages of the book, is a valuable source for Michelangelo's life and work. We learn from Condivi, among others, that Buonarroti was very much inspired by Dante, whose name is mentioned 4 times in the book, more than Petrarch, whose name appears 3 times, or Boccaccio, mentioned only once. Dante appears as a source of reading. Ogni sera da lui si faceva leggere qualche cosa di Dante o del Petrarca e talvolta del Boccaccio finché si addormentasse. It's a story of Michelangelo's sojourn in Bologna, but he read in the evenings, among others, Dante. Dante is also mentioned as a source of inspiration for sculpted and painted works by Michelangelo, as for example, Pope Julius II tomb, where Dante, del quale è sempre stato studioso, Michelangelo inspires, according to the biographer, the figure of Lea. Condivi goes on and writes that Dante, that Michelangelo ha specialmente ammirato, dilettato del mirabil ingegno di quell'uomo, qual lui ha quasi tutto a mente. The biographer then recalls that Michelangelo not only cited Dante and Petrarch by heart, but also composed sonnets himself, ma di comporre anche talvolte, come si vede per alcuni sonetti, che si trovano dei suoi che danno buonissimo saggio della grande invenzione e giudizio suo, that of Michelangelo, of course. Insisting on Dante as a source of reading, creation, and writing for Michelangelo is not only an historical fact sustained by other sources, but also a cultural attribute that enables the biographer to portray his subject as a letterato. The last example of Dante as both a passion and a source of poetic inspiration merits further examination while we read some of Michelangelo's rime. The most immediate examples for the fascination Michelangelo had for Dante as a role model is to be found in sonnets 248 and 250, as they are commonly known today. And I'm citing from one of the early editions that's composed by Michelangelo Buonarroti il Giovane, the nephew of Michelangelo. The former sonnet, what we call today sonnet 248, Dal ciel discese, appears as a clear reference for Dante that came down from heaven and had also seen hell. But the sonnet also refers, and that is interesting for our regard, the sonnet also refers to Michelangelo himself, as verse 12 makes clear, fus io pur lui, if only I were he. All translations I use this evening are from James Soslow's Standard English edition of the Rime. The author reference to Dante is repeated in the latter sonnet, 250, quante dirne se de non si può dire. All that should be said on him, Dante, could not be said. And here is, you can judge Michelangelo's poetic talents for yourself. The artist underlines his admiration of the poet, but also refers to the rift between Dante and his beloved Florence. Verses 5 to 8 include, in fact, a clear reference to the Tuscan city strained relationship with the poet, with Dante. Quando discese a merti del fallire per l'util nostro e poi a Dio accese e le porte che il ciel non li contesse, la patria chiuse al suo giusto desire. While the gates of heaven did not block for him, for Dante, recalls Michelangelo, his homeland shut his righteous desire. This injustice is highlighted in the closing verses of the sonnet that I will quote now. Se par non ebbe il suo exilio indegno, simil uom ne maggior non nacque mai. No exile was ever as undeserved as his, as Dante's, and no man equal or greater was ever born. End of quote. Michelangelo ostensibly insists here on Dante's state of exile, il suo exilio, an attribute he was convinced he had in common with the legendary poet. It is worth noting that poems 248 and 250 we just quoted were written around 1546, 1547, as Christopher Ryan, among others, proposed. This is a period in which Michelangelo was already considered de facto a fuoriuscito. In fact, Buonarroti was probably one of the most famous of the Florentine fuoriusciti, those who went out and refused to come back to Florence following the 1530 Medici restoration. Since 1532, and the nomination of Alessandro de' Medici as the first Duke of Florence, and certainly since 1537, when Alessandro was assassinated and Cosimo I de' Medici took over the Tuscan Republic turned duchy, Michelangelo and many of his close friends saw exile as the only honorable option. In that sense, Michelangelo's admiration of the Sommo Poeta held obvious political connotations, even if this was not the first motivation for the artist while turning to Dante as a source of artistic and poetic inspiration. While we examine both Michelangelo's public prise de position on the subject and the rich historiography surrounding the tandem Alighieri-Buonarroti, it is clear the association of the two figures appears quite early. Michelangelo signed the 1519 petition addressed to the Medici Pope Leo X for the transfer of Dante Alighieri's bones and ashes from Ravenna to his native soil. And as Guy Raffa noted in his Dante's Bones, Michelangelo's name stood out as he signed in Italian, not in Latin, and also promised to make a worthy tomb for the divine poet in an honorable place in the city. And of course, as we know, the Ravenna monument we see now as an illustration is a Settecento creation. And of course, the plan never realized, and Michelangelo never constructed a tomb for Dante. The most early erudite discussion with and about Michelangelo, about Dante, is Donato Gianotti's Dialoghi dei giorni che Dante consume nel cercare l'inferno e il purgatorio, where the prominent Medici opponent, Gianotti, recorded a discussion with Michelangelo of Dante's Divine Comedy. The work was written around 1546, but was published much later. To this text and the sonnets, we can add the repeated references to Michelangelo as a reader of Dante by Condivi, as we saw, as well as by Vasari and Benedetto Varchi, the highly influential historian and philosopher in Cosimo de' Medici's court. For modern scholars, as Sarah Rolfe Prodan reminds us, the influence of Dante in Michelangelo and his literary and artistic production is a topic of continuous scholarly pursuit. The literature on the subject, and particularly on Michelangelo's Danteism, is vast. The readings into Dante and Michelangelo bear thus many implications and offer diverse interpretations. It is clear, however, that the formation of a vernacular identity played a part in the affinity that the artist had towards the poet. It is also clear the admiration for Dante by Michelangelo was a conscious and continuous construction of Buonarroti's public image. Michelangelo was very much aware of his public persona, and the association with Dante served him all too well. In that sense, we must not forget that Michelangelo was not the only Medici opponent that venerated Dante. A well-known example is Bronzino's allegorical portrait of Dante, I'm showing us now, commissioned by Bartolomeo Bettini around 1532, 1533.
I think there is a problem with
you don't see the oh
image.
My God. So I was showing all the time and you went.
Yeah, sorry. now we see it.
Now you can see it. So I'll do it just like this. And I'm sorry. Here we go. Now you can see it, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Go. Thank you for the remark. So Bronzino's allegorical portrait of Dante, 1532, 1533, commissioned by Bartolomeo Bettini. Bettini was a Florentine banker, another fervent supporter of the Florentine Republic that collapsed for good in 1530. The work was most probably destined to fill a high lunette in a private chamber within Bettini's Florentine home, a project that was abandoned following the Bettini's 1534 exile. Bronzino's imposing Dante stirs at a fantastic landscape the poet created in his writings, Mount Purgatory, crowned by the earthly paradise. Dante's left hand, as you can see, holds an imposing manuscript of the Commedia, while his right hand indicates a faraway minuscule image of Berlusconi's cupola that crowns the Florentine Duomo and its neighboring campanile. In the lower left corner, we can observe the burning fires of hell. Bettini, that commissioned this magnificent portrait, had to leave Florence before the chamber decoration he conceived was completed. Yet, it is obvious that the state of exile of Dante, turning his back to Florence, was a major element of the composition even before the patron who commissioned the work had actually to leave the Tuscan city. And as Julia Simon recently observed in the Medici Portraits and Politics catalog at the Met Museum, Bronzino's Dante encourages us to examine the initial lines of the 25th canto of the Paradiso. The passage's primary theme is exile, as the banished poet imagines a never realized triumphant homecoming. Such references to Dante's exile as an exemplum were common in the anti-Palesco community, and Michelangelo, as a prominent fuoriuscito, used such allusions to carefully and knowledgeably construct his image. il suo exilio indegno, both Dante's and Michelangelo's exile, served as a leitmotif the latter exploited all too well. Michelangelo's death on the 18th of February 1564 offered the House of Medici one last valuable chance to change this narrative. The correspondence surrounding the death attests to the particular attention paid by Duke Cosimo de' Medici to the artist's legacy, both material and ideological. In addition to recovering the remaining drawings, cartoons, and sculptures left by the master in Rome, the main effort was concentrated on transferring Michelangelo's body to Florence as quickly as possible. Initially transferred to the Roman Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli, it was then taken to Florence exactly as the Duke had resolved to, as he was unable to have Michelangelo while he was alive and honor him, to have him brought to Florence after his death and given a noble and costly burial. I quote here a translation of Vasari's account that was published in the 1568 edition of the Vitae. Not only were Michelangelo's works considered valuable, but even his body could be taken over as an object of value, writes Lissapon. To this one last spectacular move by the Medici, I would like to consecrate the closing lines of this talk. On July 14th, 1564, Michelangelo was given what would be described today as a state funeral in the most Medicean of churches, the Basilica di San Lorenzo. The only comparable event might be the funeral of Raphael at the Pantheon in Rome in April 1520. However, we have no documentation of an elaborate ceremony honoring Raphael, unlike the documentation of that accorded to Michelangelo in Florence. A decision had been made to give the master a funerary oration, for which Cosimo turned to his trusted court intellectual, Benedetto Varchi, a former fuoriuscito himself. And the portrait we see now of Varchi holding a small book, maybe a book by of sonnets by Petrarch, was commissioned by him when he was still in exile. So Titian realized this portrait probably in Padova around 1540, but Varchi was back and he was asked to give the Orazione Funebre. During the 2 decades in the service of Duke Cosimo, Varchi had given only 5 other funerary orations, 2 for the military commanders, Stefano Colonna and Giambattista Savelli, 2 for Medici family members, important members, Cosimo's mother, Maria Salviati, and his daughter, Lucrezia de' Medici, Duchess of Ferrara, and 1 honoring Cardinal Pietro Bembo, arguably the most influential Italian intellectual of the Cinquecento. It was therefore highly unusual to honor with a public oration an artist who was a member neither of the clergy nor the high-ranking nobility. However, it is clear that the greatness of the funeral honors turned to the advantage not of the deceased, but of those who honored them, as Francesco Bonciani noted in his fundamental study of this practice. The rapid publication of the oration, and we still have copies of this by the ducal printer Jacopo Giunti, only days after it was given, would certainly have been owing to the editor's desire to capitalize on the high-profile event. But it was also a swift move by the Florentine ruler to represent Michelangelo, the fuoriuscito, as a prize member of the Medici court. And indeed, the oration cleverly retraces Michelangelo's origins to the School of the Arts founded by Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo de' Medici, who was almost the teacher, says Varchi. In his life, Michelangelo had been a political exile, but after his death, he was resurrected as a mere Medici creation. Varchi also insists, and this is extremely interesting with his usual rhetorical brio, on the place of Dante for the late Michelangelo. I quote Varchi: "Perciò che lasciamo stare che lui, Michelangelo, oltre l'essere fiorentino, era grave e concettoso di natura. Lasciamo stare che lui aveva fatto familiari i rimatori toscani, e specialmente Dante dico, il quale Dante non dico agguaglio ma trapasso per mio avviso, eccetera, eccetera. This is a remarkable tour de force by Varchi. He turns Michelangelo, the political exile, back into being Florentine and Tuscan. He then repeats 3 times the name Dante, e specialmente Dante dico, il quale Dante, as if nailing the reference. Both are Tuscans, both belong in Florence, and even if the Medici might have failed in bringing back Dante's remains to his birthplace, Michelangelo remains will rest forever back in Florence and not in exile. Il suo exilio indegno terminates here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sefy, for a wonderful lecture with beautiful images. I'm afraid we didn't see the very first ones, but the way you spoke about them brought them alive to us. Anyway, thank you. I will now introduce our next speaker, Kristina Olson, who is an associate professor of Italian at George Mason University. She is the author of Courtesy Lost, Dante, Boccaccio, and the Literature of History, 2014, and several articles on Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch. Her current book project is titled Dante's Sartorial Poetics. She's also the co-editor of Boccaccio 1313 to 2013, and together with Christopher Kleinhans of the second edition of Approaches to Teaching Dante's Comedy to 2020. She currently serves as the president of the American Boccaccio Association. Kristina, please.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I hope you can all hear me. Yes, good. So thank you to the organizing committee for bringing us all together in this wonderful conference. I so much wish that we had been able to be together in Jerusalem. I'd just like to say that I've really enjoyed all the papers so far. I think you're going to hear a lot of resonance with the subjects that I'm going to treat, which will be fairly different from the one that we just heard, but there's definite resonance, especially with Justin Steinberg's talk and with Roberto Morosini's talk that we heard yesterday. So I'll begin. The realms of Dante's afterlife have been employed in journalism during the past 2 decades, if not more, to capture the experiences of migrants attempting to enter Europe and America. Like so many souls who, fleeing their native hells, wish to find refuge in a real-life purgatory. As one example, Nicholas Ferrell evokes Dante's conception of purgatory, the intermediate realm of Dante's tripartite vision of the afterlife, in his article, Italy's Migrant Purgatory, published in The Spectator a few years ago. In addition to the Dantean allusion in the title, Ferrell frames his account of the migrants in Ravenna by referencing the proximity of their camp to Dante's tomb multiple times. Here I'm just showing you a few. However, Ferrell overlooked, amazingly, how Dante's life resembled the experiences of these migrants. The poet himself, as we know, had been in exile in Ravenna, having been banished from his native Florence. If Ravenna hosted Dante in the last years of his life, the city now finds itself a temporary dwelling for Senegalese and Nigerian migrants as they are delayed in northern Italy, waiting to cross the border into other EU countries. I begin with Ferrell's article not to expose all too easily one journalist's ignorance of Dante, and here much more can be said about Nicholas Ferrell, his stance on migration, his biography of Mussolini, and so forth. Considered seriously, the labeling of current migratory landings and enclaves according to Dante's afterlife reveals productive distinctions and congruencies between Dante's ideas of migration and migratory realities in today's Italy. So taking Ferrell's title at its word, I ask, could one truly call Italy a migrant purgatory if it is Dante's purgatorial realm that is understood? Prior to the Commedia, descriptions of purgatory did not feature the precise topography which Dante invents, a mountain with terraces located in the southern hemisphere of Earth. In the Inferno, we learn from Virgil that this mountain was formed as the result of a seismic event caused by Lucifer's fall from heaven, notably the first scriptural description of banishment, a forced migration from heaven. His vertical plunge from heaven to earth caused, in turn, a migration of land masses from the southern hemisphere to the northern, noted in these verses with the verb fugir, to flee. Dante's Purgatory is a mountain born of this double migration. The early illustrator Alessandro Velutello visualizes these strata of Mount Purgatory, water, and the earth's core in his depiction here, Purgatorio 1. And here we can observe Virgil and Dante in the process of rising through this underwater channel that connects Lucifer with the shores of Mount Purgatory in the southern hemisphere. If migration and exile are written into Dante's origins for purgatory, then the theme of nostos, the return to one's homeland after a forced migration due to war or displacement, is equally essential to the experience of souls who arrive on its shores. Dante and Virgil witness their ship arriving with an angel at its helm, which Velutello, again here Velutello, renders as larger to convey its grandiosity, dwarfing the many human souls in its care. The pilgrim notices that the souls sing of the flight of the Israelites from Egypt, quoting directly the first words of Psalm 113 in the Vulgate. In exito Israel de Egitto, cantavan tutti insieme ad una voce, con quanto di quel salmo è poscia scritto. While we are told that the newly arrived souls sing more than just a few words about the Israelites, Dante brings our attention only to the verse that conveys the flight from Egypt and the journey home to Israel. This verse bears great importance for Dante's understanding and expression of the redemption of souls, as we learn from his Convivio. Dante read the exit from Egypt as the flight of the soul from sin, whereby it becomes sanctified and free. That is the anagogic reading of this verse from the psalm, demonstrated in the Convivio to perform this third level of reading beyond the literal sense. And here I'm just sharing with you this passage. Dante also employs the same psalm in his epistle to Can Grande. However, here he does so to demonstrate all four senses of allegory: the literal, the moral, the allegorical, and the anagogical. The return of the Israelites to their homeland after their captivity and exile thus represents for Dante what occurs once a soul has been freed of sin and made pure. Yet while the souls that arrive on the shores of Mount Purgatory are stripped of their physical bodies, they still must complete their expiation before ascending to heaven. The song of the newly arrived souls on these shores implies the trajectory that awaits them. Dante the Pilgrim is much more like today's migrants who come to Italy's shores to seek a better life than the anonymous collective of souls who arrive on the shores of Mount Purgatory. The pilgrim, a lost soul in the dark wood who leaves a state of despair and disorientation, having lost the right way, undertakes this journey with Virgil as his guide, as a means of gaining experience of the world beyond, much like the poet's Ulysses, about whom I will speak more in a moment. The transformative nature of this journey echoes in broad strokes with the migrant's search for a better life, one that is free of suffering. As Justin Steinberg mentioned earlier, as he discussed earlier in his very important talk, like the migrants labeled clandestini, refugees who seek asylum upon Italic shores, Dante the Pilgrim appears to break the laws that govern the movement of souls in the afterlife as he journeys throughout all three realms. The spirits he encounters, and especially the guardians of these realms, including Chiara and Minos, the demons at the gates of Dis, as we heard, and Cato of Utica, often question how a living soul is allowed to experience the afterlife. To Cato, Virgil explains that the pilgrim's journey was set into motion by the three blessed ladies of heaven and appeals to Cato's love of liberty, for which he took his own life rather than live under Caesar's tyranny. Or ti piace aggredir la sua venuta, libertà va cercando che si cara, come sai chi per lei vita rifiuta. With these verses, Virgil nuances the narrative regarding the pilgrim's journey. Not only is it to save Dante from perdition, but it is to experience freedom. So Purgatorio begins with the pilgrim as a refugee in search of freedom. The pilgrim as a seafaring refugee appears right actually at the beginning of the Inferno. Here, the pilgrim sees a mountain, which is meant to evoke, we believe, many commentators believe, to evoke Mount Purgatory, and then describes himself as a fugitive that was who's the first to survive a dangerous sea voyage, as you see on the left here, with again the verb fugiva. This simile of the sea voyager who has made it across the pass that no one has crossed alive, also opens Purgatorio, where the poet lifts the sails of his talent ship now that he enters kinder waters after crossing a cruel sea. Per correr miglior acque alza le velle, ormai la navicella del mio ingegno, che lascia dietro sé mar sì crudele. In the Yates-Thompson manuscript, this vessel occupies the middle of the historiated P from the word per. Likewise, the pilgrim continues to be described as a sea voyager once he has reached these shores, as you can see here in the third quote in the bottom right. Noi eravam lungesso mare ancora, come gente che pensa al suo cammino, che va col cuore e col corpo dimora. Dante the pilgrim succeeds in landing after his sea journey, whereas Ulysses, as we know, did not, at least according to Dante's version of Ulysses. The pilgrim's characterization does not stop, that is, as a seafaring refugee, does not stop once he has reached Mount Purgatory. His ascent to the heaven of the moon is described as a sea voyage within this Ulyssian vein. At the beginning of the second canto of Paradiso, the poet tells his reader that in their small boat, that they are not to follow him in this voyage there. As you can see in this quote here on the screen, O voi che siete in piccioletta barca, desiderosi di ascoltar, seguiti dietro al mio legno che cantando varca, tornate a riveder i vostri liti, non vi mettete in pelago, che forse, perdendo me, rimarreste smarriti. Dante's interpretation of Ulysses and the poet's analogies between the pilgrim and the sea voyager lead us to understand his definition of migration, I would argue, in a different way. For Dante, migration is not only the mass movement of peoples as they flee warfare or return home, as in the case of the Israelites, or as one might define some asylum seekers today. Migration is also the quest for experience or knowledge. It is an intellectual pursuit, which is a human inclination and right. It is similar to the quest for the better life, referred to in the context of recent migrants today, but also the human right for happiness that Dante describes here in this passage in the Convivio. In this sense, Dante is reminding us that refugees are those who seek not to deny themselves the human right for happiness, that is, the happiness that is achieved by knowledge. We are not meant to live as his Ulysses says, as brutes. Now I'm going to shift gears to talk about the artworks of contemporary African artists that really sort of dialogue with these themes of migration and voyage. And we can see that these spiritual and intellectual journeys that I'm arguing define migration in the Commedia really faithfully align with the visions of some of these artists. These works were collected by Simon Najami in his exhibit, The Divine Comedy, Heaven, Purgatory, and Hell, revisited by contemporary African artists. And this was an exhibit that traveled around the world. It was here at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. It was also in Germany. The published catalog here is quite an interesting book, as I'm about to discuss. Reflection upon the themes of travel and migration can be found in Najami's introductory essay to the exhibit catalog, which recognizes what have been described as the migratory themes of Dante's afterlife, here with both the myths of Orpheus and Ulysses in mind. And I'll read this quote. Like Orpheus, he, Dante, set off on a journey that is forbidden to humans, a journey into worlds to which we have no access, and he returned. This tale, which the world at large has been able to read for centuries, is the account of this unlikely odyssey. In his tale, Dante indicated that the journey is within everyone's reach. It can never literally be his journey again, but it is meant to be lived as a metaphor above all, and it is up to us to make it exist in the concrete world of the living. Najami's characterization of the featured artists in his collection also relates strongly to themes of migration and travel, as you can see in the quote below. I see it more, and this no doubt justifies the shadow of Dante, as an initiatory journey in which the artists are the narrators who have returned from faraway lands, places that are inaccessible to anyone who has not solved some of the mystery that constitutes mankind. Again, viewing the artists in this Orphic key, Najami perceives Dante, and so in an Orphic key, not necessarily in a Ulyssian key. Najami perceives Dante and his own artists in common terms as those who have journeyed great distances away from home, only to execute such insightful work upon their return. The confluence of Dante, travel and migration, articulated in Najami's essay, is not always legible in the artworks included in the exhibit. It's not the predominant theme of the exhibit. Yet it is possible to read these themes in the artworks outside of the curator's vision. That is to say, one can perceive a recurring reflection upon the experiences of migration as suffering, aspiration, and prolonged periods of waiting in these works. More importantly, is that perhaps I would say is that the artist's experiences and understanding of migration refracted through Dante's hell and purgatory create art itself. One provocative example of this reflection is the installation of the late Senegalese artist Ndari Lo in his work The Day After, which was executed between 2012 and 2013. Lo wrote about this work. I see the world we are living in as both hell and purgatory. Our only hope in this life of ours, all that we have left, is to try our best to be admitted to heaven someday. The Day After is an installation in which, after walking a long way through a dense and dark forest, one reaches that space where everything seems to be suspended, where one can feel this particular tension that we experience before embarking on a journey of which we don't really know the name. Excuse me, let me get to there. Lo's metal cast sculptures of willowy human figures, as you see here, take off in flight en masse, yet the distinctive individuality of each figure is also perceived. It is Lo's representation of the mass migration of individuals. Yet, as Lo writes, his sculptures capture the moment after these individuals left the selva oscura of Inferno 1 and reached a state of suspension, a word that Dante uses twice in his description of limbo. Virgil describes himself as amidst those who were sospesi, suspended, when Beatrice came to find him. Io era tra color che son sospesi. And later, Dante recognizes many accomplished men who were suspended in that limbo, che in quel limbo eran sospesi, verse 45. The experience of these willowy souls who hang in the air, I would argue, resembles Dante's limbo, but they are about to leave that infernal state for a purgatorial one in which one can travel. As in the journalist Farrell, who I quoted at the beginning of this talk, his obvious conflation of limbo and purgatory, it appears that the description of a state of waiting that is both infernal and purgatorial captures best the experience of these migrants. Najami chose to feature Lo's installation in the section of the catalog that he titles Paradise. This choice is difficult to comprehend given the artist's own rationale, as well as the non-migratory nature of Dante's vision of paradise, unless the curator had in mind the flight of souls from the earthly paradise into the heavenly spheres. But regardless of its location in the exhibition, which in many cases might be called arbitrary, Lo's installation captures the spirit of migration as we would envision it for those souls embarking for a new realm, of numerous bodies in flight for a new journey. Two other works, both films, stand out for their obvious engagement with depictions of exile and migration, both of which are also featured in Najami's second section entitled Paradise. Egyptian artist Youssef Nabil's film, You Never Left, produced in 2010, equates exile with death, featuring actors Fanny Ardant and Tahir Rahim as they run across a desert landscape which is meant to represent Egypt. Najami accentuates the migratory status of Nabil's work. He considers the film a self-portrait, one that tells the story of leaving his home country, hoping to find life in another place. At the end of it, one discovers that life starts anew elsewhere, in another land, another realm. The narrative closes by showing the wandering soul of the son who returns to the comfort of a mother figure to paradise. Nabil himself recognizes the necessity of his migratory journey to the production of his work. Since I began my journey, I have traveled to many places, and each time I experience it as if it were the last time I would ever go there. Maybe I would not be able to return to that place again. His travels have fueled his art that depicts migration. At the same time, he has said that his work is an allegorical other place, which has been used as a metaphor for a lost Egypt. Nabil's thoughts describe art both as the fruit of migration and as the creation of the place which he lost upon departure, a homeland that to which he does not expect to return except through the experience of his art. The nuanced relationships of Nabil to migration and art are further enriched by his dialogue with Dante's poem. The inverse relationship between the film's protagonist, the film protagonist's exile from his home country, proposed as Egypt, and that of the Song of the Purgatorial Souls in Exito Israel de Egyptu, brings into relief the changed map of exile migration for these artists. In other words, Egypt as motherland, not as the country in which one lives out exile. I have one last artist to talk about. I will do so very quickly, I promise. Finally, the Franco-Algerian artist Zineb Sidira created a film entitled Guiding Light, produced in 2013, which also revises Dante's migratory map. Repeated images of the sand substitute the sea as the territory to be crossed by migrants. In Sidira's film, the desert comes to be perceived as the ocean in an incessant loop, with the undulations of sand merging into the waves of the sea, as she writes, and I'm not going to read this quote. While these binaries might appear simple, set against the complexity of Dante's poetics of migration, Sidira's film itself blurs such stark oppositions, and especially the ways in which Sidira talks about migration, as you can see here in this quote to the left. As she explains, these are the narratives for the multifaceted journeys undertaken by young African men and women looking for a better life, traveling towards the horizon in search of a spiritual perspective on life and hope. As we remember, Ulysses repeatedly references land masses on the horizon, as well as the stars that await them beyond, that spur him to journey further in order to experience the world that lies beyond the sun. Non vogliate negar l'esperienza di retro al sol. So to conclude, the art of Lo, Nabil, and Sidira builds upon Dante's poetics of migration in ways that allow us to appreciate the ambiguous experience of migration today. Not stuck in limbo, yet without the guarantees of salvation with which Dante's purgatorial souls possess, migrants from Africa are suspended in time as they aim to complete a journey towards an uncertain horizon. Their journey is stationary and transitory at once. Their possible geographical destinations appear limitless, but like the horizon, they recede out of reach. The migrants of today must achieve the impossible task of breaking the laws of the afterlife, as the pilgrim does, who visits both realms as a living soul, as these migrants today attempt to find a place of rest, as they attempt to find a new life in the afterlife. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both of you. This was an intellectual and visual feast, although heavy topics were addressed.
Coming to Dante, Auerbach decided to apply in a new way, the notion of figura, a way completely different from the biblical exegetical tradition he had studied until that moment. So he applied it to Dante, Scato, and Virgil in order to show how it can explain the relationship between the earthly life of such persons and their representation in the other world offered in Dante's poem. So the two terms of their relationship are the earthly life of a character and his or her condition in the afterlife. We could define this kind of figurality as sort of eschatological figuralism. It is Auerbach's great merit bringing to Dante's studies the notion of figura, but his use of such a notion is, to my opinion, anticlimactic, disappointing, and not particularly useful. Indeed, it had a great success, especially in Italian Dante criticism in the 50s and in the 60s of the last century, combined with the reading of his successful book, Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature, 1946, as well as with the realistic turn in the Italian post-war literature. It became a model for realistic approaches not only to the interpretation of Dante's comedy, but also a topic in literary debates and a model for modern writers such as Pierpaolo Pasolini and others. Auerbach developed also a more faithful application of such an exegetical tool. In a couple of essays written after the war, he applied the genuine figural reading of the Bible to Dante studies in new ways, I'm thinking to the articles Figurative Text Illustrating Certain Pages of Dante's Commedia, 1946, and Soul's Pride, 1949. The first one opened remembering his previous article, Figura, then adds, here, in this new article, I intend to discuss some more particular passages, the understanding of which may be advanced in the light of figurative text. The figurative interpretation of the Bible created a world of interrelations, a world in which medieval theologians moved quite naturally and which was familiar even to laymen through sermons, religious representations, and art. In such a perspective, Auerbach gave new readings of a few Dante passages, taking into account the Christological figurality attributed to the eagle in biblical exegesis, in order to better understand the eagle in Dante's dream in Purgatorio 9, or the Christological figurality attributed to Dante's humility when danced in front of the Holy Ark, in order to better explain Dante's reference to the humble psalmist in Purgatorio 9. He also proposed a new interpretation of Beatrice as figure of the apparition of Christ. But in his great attention to the representation of Dante's characters, Auerbach failed to give attention to the most important one of them, Dante himself. In more recent time, with extremely interesting developments, figural relationship has been widely applied to the interpretation of Dante himself as protagonist of the poem or as its author. In the late 90s, Emilio Pasquini reinterpreted Dante's trend to self-corrections and palinodies in new ways thanks to the critical tool of figurality. It is a sort of intratextual figurality in which, as he says, Dante's so-called minor works are seen as figural of the Inferno as figural of the Purgatorio, and Purgatorio of Paradiso. More interestingly, in my opinion, the figural interpretation has been used by a variety of Dante scholars to explain the modalities by which Dante applies episodes and characters from the classical world, from biblical tradition, and from ancient and recent history to himself, as protagonist of the poem or as its author. Figurality is thus sewn into the autobiographical structures of his poem and the complex strategies of his self-portraiture. Especially interesting in this sense is the use of biblical models from the Old Testament and from the New as figures in constructing the identity of Dante qua character or Dante qua poet. This approach has the interesting merit to establishing a relation between two different texts and two different phases of religious knowledge, like in the original figuralism of biblical exegesis, in which figura connected Old Testament to the New Testament, but also to the history and the actuality of the church and of Christianity. There was also the possibility of an eschatological figuralism, by far, to my opinion, the less interesting and peculiar aspect of the thing, although the only one Auerbach was interested in. On the other hand, a strong figural phase surfaced in the 90s, also among scholars interested in relations between Dante and the classical world. And in the same way, this paradigm has been applied in the last decades to the relation between Dante and the Bible. Scholars has also shown as biblical and classical figurality are often intertwined in Dante, so that the analysis must take into account a multiplicity of figures and models activated in order to build the complex personality of Dante and I. From its opening, the Commedia stresses the importance of biblical models behind the construction of the pilgrim poet by transforming, for instance, Isaiah in di medio dierum mearum in nel mezzo nel cammin di nostra vita. And the first words spoken by the protagonist recall David's words, miserere di me. Although the formula was widely used, the allusion to David is clear, since the king was the archetypal model of the sinner who asks for God's mercy and is willing to undergo a penitential process. Similarly, in Inferno 2, Aeneas and Paul are presented as great exemplary figures, but also as precursors of Dante's character, divinely chosen to go on a journey through the afterlife, part of a providential mission. Paul is there described as the vas delezione, namely the vessel of God's decision to transform certain people beyond their individual merits into instruments to carry out his will. From the Commedia's beginning, Dante points to Paul as a key model for constructing his identity as both as character and poet. Equally, in Inferno 2, Dante is alluding to the scriptural model of the person chosen by God who recognizes their limitations, as famously occurred to Moses. In the earthly paradise, the pilgrim is granted apostolic connotations by a comparison with Peter, James, and John, overwhelmed by Jesus' transfiguration. Furthermore, Beatrice invests him with a responsibility to write down what he sees, which accurately repeats the order John receives at the beginning of Revelation. The Pauline figurality is especially important in the third cantica, where Paul is constant point of reference. It is not surprising, therefore, that already Paradiso 1, 5, 6 should echo Paul's declaration of ineffability regarding his rapture to paradise. Although Paradiso's first invocation is dense with Ovidian allusions, when Dante Poet asks Apollo to make him del tuo valor si fatto vaso, is again alluding to Paul, the vas electionis. The apostle returns to, again, together with Aeneas, at the start of the encounter with Cacciaguida in Paradiso 15, which is decisive for the shaping of the pilgrim's prophetic identity. And the heaven of the fixed stars, where Dante character is examined on the theological virtues, is heavily imbued with scriptural references, which can be read in a figural perspective. A special strength have here to the figural relation with Paul and David. Classical characters, too, offer several models with which Dante constructs his identity on a figural basis. Among the Virgilian ones, Aeneas obviously occupies a position of primacy, but also myths taken from Ovid's Metamorphoses provide a range of characters from whom Dante originally adapted to construct his character as sometimes his poet. Among them, Phaeton, Icarus, Glaucus, Semele for the character, Pierus' daughters, Marcias, Jason for the poet. Among the other words, classical characters employed to forge the character's identity as a voyager and Dante's as a poet, Ulysses holds a special place, and this relation has been convincingly read in a figural perspective too. Metaphorical projections and models, both positive and negative, are also deployed in relation to other characters whom the pilgrim meets in the afterlife and whose stories prefigure his biographical vicissitudes as these are presented in the poem. In particular, this type of identification is employed to address the question of his unjust exile with characters like Pierre de Levigne, Romeo of Villanova, Boetius. The last one is not only a figura dantis as a righteous unjustly condemned and persecuted, but also as a sacred author who, in exile and suffering persecution, takes on the task of writing a work that will bring salvation to his readers. So Dante alludes to a number of biblical, classical, and historical characters as figure of himself, both as protagonist and as author of the comedy. I think that for this aspect of Dante's poem, the notion of figura could be relevant and interesting. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Leda. And I think we are ready to our next speaker, which is Dr. Irina Chernetsky. And she is a scholar of Renaissance art and architecture and a lecturer at the History of Art department at the University of Haifa. Among her publications are the depiction of Florence as Jerusalem in Lorenzo Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise. Another one is the creation of the world by Virgil's Solis. Yet another, the vision of Florence as a new Rome, some rhetorical and visual aspects. And in addition to these articles and some others, among her publications in preparation is the book-length study, The Mythological Origins of Renaissance Florence, the city as New Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem, to be published by the Cambridge University Press in 2022. And today, Dr. Chernetsky will speak on Dante's architectural image of Florence. Please.
Thank you very much for introducing me, and thank you very much for having me here at this fascinating conference. Just a moment, I'm sharing the presentation. Yes. Yes. So, let's start here. Even the most casual stroll through the streets of Florence may lead to the Ponte Vecchio, where today at the northern entrance, one finds a plaque inscribed with these verses from Dante's Commedia. Convegnesia quella pietra scema che guarda e ponte che Fiorenze fesse vittima nella sua pace postrema. The quote illustrates that when history intersects with physical space, it imbues the place with collective memory. In this instance, the events occurred in 1215. The Florentine knight Buondelmonte de Buondelmonti broke a marriage covenant with the Amidei family. His decision to marry instead a woman from the more noble Donati family brought great dishonor, not just to the immediate family, but to the entire powerful clan to which the Amidei belonged. The violence that ensued marked the starting point for the long-standing hostility between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, factions that represented, respectively, the Buondelmonti and the Amidei. Buondelmonte was murdered at the head of the Ponte Vecchio, near the column bearing an equestrian statue. This illustration, dating to the mid-14th century and depicting this cruel murder near the Ponte Vecchio, is from Giovanni Villani's, Dante's neighbor, by the way, new chronicle, La Nova Cronica. According to local belief, this statue was an ancient representation of Mars, Roman god of war and pre-Christian patron of Florence, and had once formed part of the ancient temple of Mars. Villani narrates in his Chronica that Florence was founded by Julius Caesar following architectural model of Rome. Later, in the time of Octavian Augustus, Romans built there the Temple of Mars. In contrast to other ancient Florentine structures, which survived only as ruins, this Temple of Mars remained intact and formed a prominent part of Florence's cityscape. According to Villani, in the time of Pope Sylvester I, it was in the 4th century, the Temple of Mars was consecrated to Saint John the Baptist, the Christian patron of the city. Villani narrates that the Florentines then replaced the equestrian statue of Mars, which stood in the middle of the temple, with a baptismal font, until its disappearance into the waters of the Arno in the flood of 1333. The statue of Mars was believed to avenge Florentines, plunging them into numerous dissensions, as referred by Dante in Inferno 13. Dante's verses on the bridge vividly recreate the historical context of events that occurred in the early 13th century, and, by reference to the statue of Mars, allude to the city's ancient Roman foundation. This paper focuses on the baptistry of San Giovanni, believed to be ancient temple of Mars, as part of Dante's architectural image of Florence. It considers in depth the context and symbols of this monument and the messages it conveys. In Florence, it was Dante who played a crucial role in formulating the image of his city. Dante praises Florence first and foremost in the Commedia. As Christian Beck notes, he praises not the citizens, but the city. Hell is populated by 25 Florentine malefactors. In the Purgatory, Dante encounters 3 Florentines, and in Paradise, only 2. For Dante, Florence is both the beginning, the place of his roots and his birth, and the end, the place to which he will return from his exile forever as an immortal poet. Dante underscores the ancient Roman past of Florence and describes, though fragmentarily, its topography, making particular mention of its buildings. For example, the statue of Mars, as we have seen, Mercato Vecchio in Paradiso 16, the Badia Fiorentina, located within the ancient Roman walls in Paradiso 15. That is, Dante not only praises the abstract idea of Florence, but also celebrates the concrete physical city. This theme is further elaborated in the work of Dante's admirer Boccaccio. In the Decameron, written between 1349 and 1353, characters already move through the easily recognizable topography of Florence. Boccaccio places in more detailed relief the urban surroundings and particular buildings of Florence as compared to other cities of Italy, where the stories of the Decameron unfold. For example, in novel 6-9, the protagonist Guido exits the Orsa Michele, proceeding to San Giovanni along Corso degli Adimari, while in novel 2-5, the protagonist Andreuccio roams the city of Napoli, which, though well known to Boccaccio, is described without specifics of streets or buildings. Sorry. To return to Dante, among all other Florentine monuments, the baptistry of San Giovanni bears particular importance for the poet and is mentioned several times in the Commedia. San Giovanni is the main symbol and witness of Roman Florence, memory of Dante's contemporary Florence, and, as we shall see, the emblem of Florence as a New Jerusalem. To understand Dante's image of San Giovanni, let us first consider the baptistery of Dante's epic. The octagonal building of San Giovanni is one of the most recognizable monuments of the Florentine cityscape. Gabriele Moroli's profound analysis of baptistery's architecture convincingly confirms its Romanesque origins. Present edifice was constructed between mid-11th, beginning of the 12th centuries on site of the former small early Christian baptistery. After the rich Kalimala Guild, the Guild of the International Merchants and Bankers, was awarded charge of the artistic creation in the baptistery, it was sometime between 1157 and 1193, work on the baptistery's decoration began in earnest. The floor and the ceiling of the baptistery were lavishly decorated during the 13th century. Once this stage was completed, the Florentine Republic designed a piazza around the baptistery to further emphasize the building's civic significance. A series of acts in the 1290s prohibited burials in the grounds that lay between the baptistery and the cathedral. Gravestones that had previously covered this space were removed and transported to the cathedral. In 1322, the Kalimala decided to adorn the existing wooden doors of the baptistery with metal plates, but later changed their minds in favor of doors made entirely of metal. Andrea Pisano was working on this project, described in Villani's report as being of, I quote, marvelous work and expense. The casting of the doors was entrusted to Venetian masters. Doors for two other portals were created by Lorenzo di Berti in the first half of the 15th century. The extent of the investment in the baptistery's decoration reflects its importance to the community. One of the earliest representations of the architectural image of Florence, the fresco of the Madonna of Mercy, which in 1342 adorned the loggia of the Compagnia della Misericordia residence, pays visual tribute to the baptistery's central position. This painting shows a majestic figure of the Madonna of Mercy, protecting the citizens and the city of Florence, all depicted in detail at her feet. Florence is encircled by walls designed by Arnolfo di Cambio with an inscription, Civitas Florentiae, the city of Florence, flanking the fortified portal. Among the many houses, high church towers, and civic palaces, one recognizes the unfinished marble facet of Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral, with Giotto's bell tower still under construction, the Palazzo dei Priori, the Palazzo del Podestà, the Badia Fiorentina, the churches of Santa Maria Novella and Santa Croce. The baptistery of San Giovanni, in reality rather a small building compared to these ecclesiastical and civic buildings, is here given prominence by its imposing dimensions and frontal location. In the illustrated Chronicle of Villani, the baptistery of San Giovanni is represented 15 times, much more than any other building, becoming the identifiable icon for the entire city of Florence. Florentine baptistery of San Giovanni acted on several levels as a unifying architectural symbol. In 13th and 14th century Florence, there were no baptismal fonts in the parish churches. Rather, all Florentines, almost without exception, were christened at the baptistery of San Giovanni. And in time of Dante's youth, the population of Florence is estimated at circa 70,000 inhabitants, and at the beginning of the 14th century, circa 100,000. And almost all of them were baptized in San Giovanni. In 1301, anticipating the arrival of Charles of Valois, the Florentine statesman Dino Compagni addressed an assembly of, as he said, many good citizens in the baptistery with these words, I quote, "Dear and worthy citizens who have all alike received sacred baptism at this font, reason compels and binds you to love one another like dear brothers." The most famous expression of Florentine sentiment in regard to the baptistery occurs in the Inferno 19, where Dante calls it Mio bel San Giovanni. As the political and economic power of the Florentine community grew, the interpretive history of the city grew to keep pace. Florentines envisioned their city as a new Rome, Roma Nova. In the earliest surviving chronicle of Florence, Chronica de Origine Civitatis, composed in the early 13th century, the anonymous author narrates that the city was founded by ancient Romans who built it on the architectural model of Rome. Villani proudly supported this claim, later maintained also by Coluccio Salutati, Leonardo Bruni, and others. These writers reconstructed the image of Roman Florence by identifying the landmarks and contours of the ancient city in their own contemporary city, including the Forum and Capitolium, as well as the ruins of ancient theater and an amphitheater, bath houses, aqueduct, round towers, city gates, and pavements. Of these urban elements, the Florentine baptistery, believed to be an ancient temple of Mars, stands out prominently. San Giovanni was a major urban architectural symbol that embodied contemporary Florentine ambition for the status of not only the New Rome, but also the New Jerusalem. According to recent research, in the Bigolo Misericordia fresco, Florence is portrayed as the New Jerusalem. Significantly, the view of the city is dominated by San Giovanni. During religious holidays and feast days, when the streets and buildings of Florence were transformed into the sacred city, San Giovanni came to stand for the prominent architectural monuments of Jerusalem. In processions of the Feast of the Magi, the baptistery represented the Jerusalem temple, and the platform constructed near it symbolized Herod's palace. San Giovanni also stood for the Holy Sepulchre. The octagonal form and dome with an oculus reflect the symbolic link between all baptisteries and the Anastasis Rotunda of the Holy Sepulchre. The octagonal shape represents Christ's resurrection, which is celebrated on the Easter Sunday. Sunday is the 8th day of the week and symbolizes the new beginning. The association of San Giovanni with the Holy Sepulchre was reinforced in public ceremonies on Holy Saturday, when the custom of the Holy Fire received in the anastasis of the Holy Sepulchre and carried through Jerusalem was revived in the baptistery and on the streets of Florence. I quote from Giovanni Villani's Chronica. And on Holy Saturday, when in the said fonts the baptismal water and fire were blessed, they ordered that the said holy fire should be carried through the city after the custom of Jerusalem, so that someone should enter into every house with a lighted torch for them to rekindle their fires. Florentine pilgrims were conscious of the similarities between the Holy Sepulchre and the baptistery of San Giovanni. Giorgio Gucci, for example, compares the rounded shape of the edicule to the baptistery. Marco di Bartolomeo Rustici's account of his most probably imaginary pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre mentions, I quote in English, "the beautiful lantern in the manner of St. John the Baptist of my city of Florence." A crucial role in creating the vision of Florence as a New Jerusalem through the image of Rome as a New Jerusalem was played by Dante. As a citizen of Florence, Dante elaborated upon the values of civic life on earth, rehabilitated Rome as the most powerful example of civic virtues, and glorified the Roman Empire, especially Emperor Augustus. Orosius' vision of the Augustan era, which was the era of Christ's coming, as an age of universal peace, served as the basis for Dante's vision of the role of Rome in human history. Christ's decision to be born in the time of Augustus legitimized imperial rule and also made it possible to create a parallel between Augustus, the first emperor, and Christ, the first pope. Orosius, who influenced Dante's vision of history, saw the age of Augustus as a link between the pagan and Christian eras, and Rome as a junction between earthly and heavenly patria of Christ. This idea was echoed in Purgatory 32, where Beatrice, surrounded by nymphs in paradise, says to Dante, you shall be with me forever, a citizen of that Rome whereof Christ is Roman. This is Charles Singleton translation. According to this, and because Dante places Beatrice in the highest heaven, the Empyrean becomes identified with Rome. The author stresses the analogy between Jerusalem as the place of the birth of Christ and Rome as the place of the birth of the church. One, however, must keep in mind that along with Dante's idea of Rome as the city of universal salvation, there is his idea of Florence as the final destination to which the exiled poet personally aspires. Already in Vita Nova, dated to 1294, Dante quoted the opening line of Jeremiah's lamentation on the desolation of Jerusalem, how doth the city sit solitary, to describe his feeling of despair and solitude in desolate Florence after the death of Beatrice. In the epistle dated to 1311, Dante again creates the parallel between Jerusalem and Florence. The ancient Jews, mourning over their exile in Babylon, stand as a prototype for the Florentines mourning the exile from their beloved city. Canto 25 of the Paradiso, which speaks of the yearning for the distant light of celestial Jerusalem, begins with Dante's expression of nostalgia for his native Florence and his hope to return there, if not during his earthly life, then in death and forever as a glorified poet. For Dante, the architectural symbol of Florence in the Commedia in general, and here in particular, is the baptistery of San Giovanni. Semmai continga che il poema sacro al quale ha posto mano e cielo e terra, sì che m'ha fatto per molti anni macro, vinca la crudeltà che formi sera del bello o vile ovvio dormi agnello, nimico al lupi che gli danno guerra, con altra voce omai, con altro vello, ritornerò poetà e sul fonte del mio battesimo prenderò il cappello, però che nella fede che fa conte l'anima a Dio, quivi intraio e poi Pietro per lei si mi girò la fronte. Francesco da Buzzi, one of the early commentators on Dante, notes that the word ovile, sheepfold, yes, del bello ovile, refers to Florence. The choice of the baptistery as emblematic of Florence is significant on both personal and civic levels. These verses, referring to baptism as a first step towards salvation, describe Dante's personal path towards salvation and eternal life, embodied in the eternal posthumous fame of a poet, as having its beginning and end precisely in Florence. Florence becomes Jerusalem, and San Giovanni, which according to local legend was built in the time of Augustus, ties together the poet's past, present, and future, and the city's ancient past, Christian present, and eschatological future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let me also add that I appreciate not only the content, the fascinating content of the two talks so far, but also the fact that speakers respect the limits of time. So I'm very thankful. Now our next speaker is Professor Dr. Andreas Kablitz, who teaches at the University of Cologne, where he is the director of the Petrarca Institute. He is the head of the editorial board of the Poetica and member of the editorial board of the Dante Society of America. He is also member of the academic committee of the Fritz Thyssen Stiftung, and although his special research interests center on Dante, his essays cover a wide range of topics from French, Italian, German, and English literatures, featuring Petrarch, Tasso, and other authors from the Italian and French Renaissance, as well as Shakespeare, Thomas Mann, and Oscar Wilde. He has also been working on philosophers as Aristotle, Kant, and Wittgenstein, and his last book in German, Epistemology and Aesthetics, the philosophy of poetry considered in the mirror of its historical transformations, was published by Winter Publishing House this year. Indeed, impressive width and depth of topics. And today we'll listen to Professor Dr. Kablitz talking about Auerbach's modernization of Dante's Commedia. Please.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation to this fascinating conference. And now I will talk about the topic you mentioned. I hope everybody can hear me well. If it's not the case, please tell me that it is like that. More than 19 years ago, in 1929, came out one of the most influential studies on Dante, Eric Auerbach's book, Dante Poet of the Secular World. Even after so much time, it continues to be a point of reference in Dante, in research about Dante. Its very title seems to constitute a sort of an ongoing provocation. How can the Commedia, telling a story about a journey into the other world, be a poem dedicated to the secular, to the earthly world? However, considered within the wider context of Dante's studies since the age of Romanticism, Auerbach's approach constitutes nothing but a radicalization of a general tendency to be observed since that time. Much more attention since that time was paid to the Inferno rather than to the Purgatorio or the Paradiso, and this alone indicates a remarkable ideological change in modern reception of the Sacro Poema. It less and less appears to be a holy poem. Especially the Inferno seems to allow for its establishment as a stylistic model that offers a suitable alternative to a classicist poetics. One could even say that this predominant stress on aesthetics questions in the criticism of Romanticism entails a marginalization of ideological questions which eventually will lead to an inversion of the ideological coordinates of the Commedia. But which are Auerbach's arguments that motivate his, so to say, hermeneutic reversal in order to transform a visit to the other world into an interpretation of man's earthly existence. Auerbach's claim goes far beyond the trivial fact that inevitably all representation of the other world is bound to the human conditions and limits of knowledge. Pardon. It is a much more general question which is unfolded in his book, as the early world which he discovers in Dante's Commedia is by no means the reality of everyday life. The Commedia in this sense is far from any poetic realism in a modern sense. The great achievement of Dante in Auerbach's eyes, as he states again and again, was to transform a reality that had lost its order and its evidence into a poetic vision of that same reality, as he states, that man constitutes a unity, an indivisible unity made of force and shape of the body, of reason and will, of human spirit, and that from such unity followed his specific destiny. This knowledge was present already in the Greek poetry at its beginnings. This is the first sentence of Auerbach's book. His approach is, historically as well as systematically, a very general one. He starts off from Homer and raises fundamental questions about the conditio humana. There is especially one concern that determines his reflections throughout the entire book. How can a representation of man succeed that does not reduce his nature to pure abstraction and that, at the same time, does not present him only in the contingency of single moments of his life? For the true reality of human existence in Auerbach's view is based on a synthesis of both aspects. Reality can be captured only if the capacity of mind to bring order into the world is reconciled with the stimulating force of his sensuality. Obviously, the heritage of Hegel's philosophy has huge influence on Auerbach's approach to Dante, and indeed, his reading of the Commedia is not very far from that of the German 19th century philosopher. To Auerbach, the most important achievement of Dante's poetic work, and especially of his Commedia, is to have realized a synthesis between the intellectual and the sensual sphere of man in an unsurpassable way, and it is this brilliantly realized reconciliation that makes him one of the most important figures in the history of Western literature. If Auerbach starts long before Dante in Greek antiquity, this is because he wants to demonstrate that the difficult integration of intellect and senses has been fragile from the very beginning of poetry. His intention is, so to say, to reconstruct the history of their precarious relation, and he does so by taking into consideration literature and philosophy at the same time. At first sight, it might appear astonishing that Auerbach makes no distinction between both forms of discourse, but what binds them together is more important to him than the differences between the two types of discourse. And this is especially language, as language is for Auerbach the very medium of any synthesis between intellect and senses. Yet their synthesis remains unstable, and this is why Auerbach somehow gives marks in his historical reconstruction of literature, good marks to those who were able to preserve the unity of both, and bad marks to those who did not achieve to preserve it. Plato gets the best marks, Aristotle's marks are already remarkable worse, and Plotinus is even considered to be the exponent of a so-called vulgar spiritualism, of a crude spiritualism whose disastrous influence was still effective in the days of Dante. Auerbach's historical survey presents itself as a radically historical approach. Nonetheless, on closer consideration, one will clearly recognize that it is based on a specific concern of modern thought. It is predominantly the concern to miss the sensual fear in his human thinking. A rebirth of all sensual forces are the laudatory words about the work of Francis of Assisi, in Auerbach's eyes, a very important figure in the development of Italian language. It is especially Auerbach's fear of pure or void abstraction that reveals the deeply modern origin of his concerns. On the contrary, a specifically pre-modern, philosophical as well as theological concern was the loss of the intellectual due to the overwhelming presence and effect of the senses. However, due to a decisive shift in history of Western thought after Descartes and Kant, the corporeal sphere became the terra incognita of human knowledge. As all our understanding is determined by the intellectual categories of human mind, the matter as such remains unavoidably outside of reach of human knowledge. By the way, the current prestige of body in cultural studies is nothing but another consequence of these epistemological conditions. It is by no means the symptom of an innovative epistemological turn, but the still effective heritage of a Cartesian paradigm. The inescapable intellectual character of all knowledge makes understanding matter and the senses a central problem of all knowledge. It is in the mirror of these epistemological conditions that Auerbach takes into consideration the evolution of human thought since the antiquity, thus transforming a specifically modern problem into the everlasting problem of Western thought. Christianity plays an important part in this history. As Auerbach states, the idea of incarnation, the central dogma of Christian monotheism, has contributed considerably to the re-evaluation of the corporeal world, allowing for a synthesis of matter and intellect. However, such interpretation of the role of Christianity in the evolution of Western thought has a remarkable, not to say decisive, consequence. It ultimately reduces the message of the gospel to a theoretical achievement. Any moral dimension, the history of salvation, the idea of man's liberation from the tyranny of sin and guilt and the overcoming of death becomes marginal in comparison with the theoretical accomplishment of Christianity. These consequences appear particularly striking in Auerbach's interpretation of Dante's Divine Comedy. To him, the representation of human beings in the other world is no more determined by the relation between their moral behavior and the location in the other world. The difference between this world and the other world assumes instead a predominantly, if not exclusively, theoretical function. In Auerbach's interpretation, the eternity of the transcendent existence of the souls is nothing else than the eventual stabilization of the essence of the earthly identity. The earthly identity freed from all contingent circumstances. This way, the moment of their encounter with Dante in the other world becomes the occasion of the revelation of their substantial being. And it is language that plays an important part in Auerbach's interpretation of the Commedia. Predominantly the vividness of Dante's style, a diversity never reached before in vernacular poetry, allows to make visible the substantial character of the individual beings. However, the reduction of Christianity to a mere theoretical achievement entails considerable risks for an appropriate understanding of the gospel as well of the Commedia. In no other part than in hell, such risks become clearly visible. In contemporary thought of Dante's days, the evil is defined as a privatio boni, as the lack of something good. It is hence defined by a relation of negation and in such way does not have any substance. As Augustine declared in De Doctrina Christiana, in quantum sumus mali, in quantus etiam minus sumus, to the extent that we are evil, to that same extent we are in a less way. However, in Auerbach's reading of the Sacro Poema, especially the inhabitants of hell, the condemned sinners, are presented as substantial beings. This way, the punishment of their sins mutates into an occasion to reveal their essence, a hermeneutic result that deserves and necessitates discussion. It seems difficult to marginalize in the Commedia the relevance of Christian dogma. It is rather impossible with regard to this text to neglect the drama resulting from the human resistance against God's commandments and God's salvation of mankind. Auerbach's undoubtedly impressive study, nonetheless, here comes to its limits. It looks as if Auerbach himself had noticed the historical gap between his reading of Dante, unfolded in the poet of the secular world, and the text of the Divine Comedy itself. In the chapter dedicated to Dante in his mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature, he obviously attempts to historicize his former interpretation of the Commedia, though its general tendency remains basically identical. However, Auerbach's endeavor to give his reading a more appropriate historical base dialectically reveals all the more tellingly the undeniably modern origin of his reading of the Sacro Poema. The notion which constitutes the center of Auerbach's attempt to historicize his reading of the Divine Comedy is a concept taken from the medieval interpretation of history that originates in the exegesis of the Bible, the concept of figura. Giuseppe Leda has been talking about that some minutes ago. Auerbach himself had attracted modern attention to this concept, and it's important for an adequate understanding of medieval conception of history in his groundbreaking article Figura, published in 1938. And still in the chapter Farinata e Cavalcanto of his book Mimesis, he explicitly insists on the specifically pre-modern character of this concept. The notion of figura defines a specific, at the same time semantic and historical relation between the Old and the New Testament. It allows for interpreting persons and events in the Old Testament as an announcement of the persons and events of the New Testament in order to understand them as the fulfillment of these announcements. Every figura thus corresponds to its implementum. The prophet Jonas within the belly of a big fish, where he remains for 3 days before the fish vomits him out, is a figura of Christ's death and resurrection. King David bringing back the ark to Jerusalem is a figura of the annunciation of the word becoming flesh. Dante himself, by the way, has used this traditional interpretation of the relation between biblical events in his images of the Exempla Humilitatis in Canto 10 of the Purgatory. Indeed, Dante makes multiple use of the concept of figura in his Sacro Poema, extending it, even as I have tried to demonstrate in a former article, to spatial instead of temporal relationships. This way, the Valletta dei Principi at the foot of the Mount of Purgatory, where the negligent princes are located within the anti-purgatory, becomes a figura of the earthly paradise at the top of the mountain. Auerbach, however, in this mimesis, uses the concept of figura in order to characterize the general relationship between the earthly and the other world in Dante's Commedia. The earthly existence of man, bound to the contingencies of his life, is nothing but a figura of the revelation of his substance in the implementum of his existence in the other world. Quoting Auerbach, we behold an intensified image of the essence of their being, fixed for all eternity in gigantic dimensions. Behold it in a purity and distinctness which could never for one moment have been possible during their lives upon earth. At first sight, such ontological interpretation of the relation between figura and implementum might seem to be in perfect harmony with the deeply Christian idea of man. Earthly life is nothing else than an examination of man's suitability for heaven, his homeland. Only in heaven man will reach the fulfillment of his being. As St. Paul states, we see now through a glass in a dark manner, but then in face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know even as I'm known. However, on closer consideration, the relation between this world and the other world, as defined by Auerbach, is not an ontological, but an epistemological one. In his view, the other world reveals the very essence of human individuals. It makes visible their substantial being. The other world is not the place of the constitution, but of the revelation of the essence of individuals, which determines their earthly life. This has, by the way, a quite remarkable consequence, for ultimately the other world and poetry itself become structurally identical. If Dante's art is able to demonstrate by the mastery of his style the very essence of individual personalities, then the role of the other world and the function of poetry become interdependent. The other world, in other words, becomes a poetological sphere. This is, it may be said parenthetically, a quite romantic concept of poetry. It could look as if, again, there is some similarity between Dante's and Auerbach's idea of poetry. Dante certainly would not deny that his Commedia is devoted in large part to the revelation of truth. However, the respective conditions of such revelation of truth differ considerably. In Dante's case, it is widely due to inspiration. Dante, is granted the access to a knowledge unreachable to everyone else. On the contrary, to Auerbach, the revelation of substantial being is the work of art, of poetry itself, and the effect of its specific use of language. Consequently, the relation between figura and implementum is completely changed. It even equals its inversion. As Auerbach himself states, it was precisely the Christian idea of the indestructibility of the entire human individual which made this possible for Dante. And it was precisely by producing this effect with such power and so much realism that he opened the way for that aspiration toward autonomy which possesses all earthly existence. In the very heart of the other world, he created a world of earthly beings and passions so powerful that it breaks bounds and proclaims its independence. Figure surpasses fulfillment, or more probably, the fulfillment serves to bring out the figure in still more impressive relief. However, is the style of language powerful enough to invert the traditional relation between this world and the other world, and to transform the other world into the birthplace of human autonomy. The moral structure of the Sacro Poema seems to be hardly compatible with such interpretation of the Commedia. It is a quite modern metaphysics of art that underlies Auerbach's reading of Dante, a 19th century and rather German philosophy where aesthetics replaces, or at least leads to, ontology. Auerbach's impressive reading of Dante raises a number of questions difficult to answer. Its intellectual brilliance and the inner coherence of its argument are beyond any doubt. However, what about its hermeneutic plausibility or even legitimacy? His interpretation certainly guarantees topicality to Dante's work under the conditions of modernity. However, can such topicality replace exegetical validity? On the other hand, can great poetry survive without any topicality? And if so, which are the criteria of its timeless artistic value? Obviously, Auerbach's reading of the Commedia raises fundamental questions as to Dante, poet of world literature. It turns out to be a real challenge to the notion of world literature. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks for all three speakers. And if I may, thank all three speakers. And now I speak as somebody who is not an expert, and like you all, I'm not an expert on Dante, but definitely I'm very grateful for this. For me personally, it was invitation to reread Dante, and of course Auerbach, and also to go to Florence. So I'm grateful to all three speakers, and I believe we can conclude the session. Thank you, Gur, for everything, and thanks all three speakers and all participants.